Susan, let's listen to some of what Dr. Fiona Hill said yesterday. The former top Russia aide to the White House was asked about testimony from Ambassador Gordon Sondland's deposition when he accused Hill of being, quote, emotional during a June 18th meeting while describing himself as being a shoulder to cry on. Here's how Dr. Hill recalled that meeting.
I think you might recall in my deposition on October 14th that I said that very unfortunately I had a bit of a blow-up with Ambassador Sondland, and I had a couple of testy encounters with him. One of those was in June 18 when I actually said to him, "Who put you in charge of Ukraine?" And, I'll admit I was a bit rude, and that's when he told me the president, which shut me up. And this other meeting, it was about 15, 20 minutes, exactly as he depicted it was. I was actually, to be honest, angry with him. And, I hate to say it, but often when women show anger, it's not fully appreciated. It's often, pushed onto emotional issues, perhaps, or deflected onto other people. And what I was angry about was that he wasn't coordinating with us. Now, I actually realised, having listened to his deposition, that he was absolutely right, that he wasn't coordinating with us because we weren't doing the same thing that he was doing. So I was upset with him that he wasn't fully telling us about all of the meetings that he was having. And he said to me, "But I'm briefing the president. I'm briefing Chief of Staff Mulvaney. I'm briefing Secretary Pompeo, and I've talked to Ambassador Bolton. Who else do I have to deal with?" And the point is we have a robust interagency process that deals with Ukraine. It includes Mr. Holmes. It includes Ambassador Taylor as the chargé in Ukraine. It includes a whole load of other people. But it struck me yesterday when you put up on the screen Ambassador Sondland's emails and who was on these emails, and he said, "These are the people who need to know," that he was absolutely right, because he was being involved in a domestic political errand. And we were being involved in national security foreign policy, and those two things had just diverged. So he was correct, and I had not put my finger on that at the moment. But I was irritated with him and angry with him that he wasn't fully coordinating. And I did say to him, Ambassador Sondland, Gordon, I think this is all going to blow up, and here we are.
So, Susan, on the list of quotes that will be remembered from these 2 weeks, he was being involved in a domestic political errand, maybe near the top of the most memorable.
Absolutely. And what I thought was so interesting about Dr. Hill's testimony was that she was able to outline that it was, by repeating Sondland's testimony, that it was Mick Mulvaney, it was Secretary Pompeo, it was Secretary Perry. These are all people who were operating under the president's authority and operating a political agenda while she was trying to take care of protecting our country. And at what conflict and what frustration, of course, she must have had, because her mission was to carry out foreign policy and protect our country. These guys were just really trying to help the president. And I think it brings in another interesting point, which is, was Rudy Giuliani speaking to all of these people as an attorney for the president, which would mean that they were all not working on behalf of the government, but on behalf of Donald Trump personally, which could be a violation of certain rules? Or was Rudy Giuliani given permission to act as a part of the government, which, in case he never went through background checks or anything else, I think his role will be thoroughly investigated.
Admiral Stavridis, there was an interesting moment, too, when Dr. Hill said she assumed there was a shadow foreign policy being conducted by Rudy Giuliani and Gordon Sondland. And then yesterday she sort of revised that thought and said, oh, no, that was the foreign policy. And it was coming from the ambassador to the EU who had no jurisdiction over Ukraine. Why was he here meddling in our business? And what you have, again, is State Department and national security officials who found themselves to be working at odds with people in their own government.
Indeed, and I know Fiona quite well. In fact, Willie, when I was preparing to go be the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and I was looking around and casting about for experts to talk to, everybody said, oh, you've got to talk to Dr. Fiona Hill. The point I want to make is her knowledge of Russia, Ukraine, this region is really quite unparalleled. She is brilliant, as you saw. And she's also kind of tough as nails. She's literally a coal miner's daughter from the north of England. She's not backing up to anybody. And so when you have that kind of collision between legitimate national security, which of course is getting this aid to the Ukrainians, Ukraine has a dagger at its throat from Russia. This is big casino for them. And that national security imperative diluted, colliding with this domestic agenda. I've never seen anything like it. And I spent 7 years as a combatant commander, both in Latin America and the Caribbean and in Europe, working on this kind of foreign military assistance. Never saw it diluted in the domestic sphere. Fiona Hill is Donald Trump's worst nightmare.
And Mika, as Admiral Stavridis says, we have a long list of national security officials, career diplomats who came over the last 2 weeks and told the truth and did something that perhaps Donald Trump and the White House couldn't understand, which was not put loyalty to the president before loyalty to the country. Here I am as a fact witness, they said, and Fiona Hill said again yesterday, here I am telling you what I saw. I'm not going to give you my opinion on whether or not I think the president should be impeached, but here's what I saw and here's what I heard.
Yeah, these witnesses are very important because, as Dr. Hill testified, they were pursuing the national security interests of the United States, and the president was trying to subvert that for his own personal political benefit. Now, these are a group of people who are copious note takers, who have the sense of separation between politics and national security. They're all bound by this thing called the Hatch Act, which prohibits them from engaging in political activity on the job. So when they start seeing this kind of political activity, it is deeply alarming to them. We have rules and laws in place to try and prevent that from happening, because people realize that political benefit really is about people's personal benefit. It is not in the national security interest of the United States. And these are people who could put those words into the president's mouth himself.
So, Michael Steele, one common theme from Dr. Hill and David Holmes' testimony was that the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, was a problem. Listen to this.
I had already brought to Ambassador Bolton's attention the attacks, the smear campaign against Ambassador Yovanovitch. I'd asked if there was anything that we could do about it. And Ambassador Bolton had looked pained, basically indicated with body language that there was nothing much that we could do about it. And he then, in the course of that discussion, said that Rudy Giuliani was a hand grenade that was going to blow everyone up.
Did you understand what he meant by that?
I did, actually.
What did he mean?
Well, I think he meant that, obviously, what Mr. Giuliani was saying was pretty explosive in any case. He was frequently on television making quite incendiary remarks about everyone involved in this, and that he was clearly pushing forward issues and ideas that would, probably come back to haunt us. And, in fact, I think that that's where we are today.
It became apparent that Mr. Giuliani was having a direct influence on the foreign policy agenda that the three amigos were executing on the ground in Ukraine. In fact, at one point during a preliminary meeting of the inaugural delegation, someone wondered aloud why Mr. Giuliani was so active in the media with respect to Ukraine. My recollection is that Ambassador Sondland stated, quote, "Damn it, Rudy, every time Rudy gets involved, he goes and F's everything up."
Well, there's another quote we can pull from the historic 2 weeks. Michael Steele. Rudy Giuliani, again, we know this already. We've known this for a long time. The president's personal attorney, not an employee of the government, running this entire operation.
Absolutely. He's doing exactly what Donald Trump wants him to do. It is that bit of separation from Trump directly that puts Rudy in the space where he can go in and he can throw Trump's name around, and he's got the power of that behind him. All of these career officials, they're kind of stuck. They're sort of stumbling over how to work with this person who has been put there by the president. So there's respect for that. I mean, because that's part of the traditional, conventional way of looking at these things. If you're an envoy or representative of the president on certain matters, people give you some deference. But when it goes counter to the nation's foreign policy, that's where things get muddied. And I thought Dr. Hill yesterday just put it so profoundly out there for all of us to see. But here's the rub, Willie. None of it really matters because the bet right now in the White House is the polling is showing that people are sliding off of this whole idea of impeachment. The United States Senate Republicans have been affirmed by the voice of one Congressman Will Hurd yesterday, who was the hope in the House, who basically stood on the front porch of Donald Trump and said, "This is my space now." So the reality that we're all left with is that despite the explosive testimonies, the profound importance of that testimony, the consequences will virtually be non-existent. And unless and until, to Eugene's point, there is a movement by the public towards something more severe, Rudy Giuliani will continue to do what Rudy Giuliani is doing. Donald Trump will continue to do what he is doing. And the rest of us are going to be left scratching our head going, what happened?
Yeah, I mean, Michael, if Will Hurd was one of the hopes for Democrats, a vote that they could swing to their side on the impeachment vote, and he's come out already. He used his question time yesterday, as you said, to say, I can't vote for impeachment. He's a former CIA officer. He's concerned about some of the things he saw. But he says, look, I've listened to all this evidence. It might be bad, but it's not. It doesn't warrant removing the president from his office. So if he's saying that, I think we know what everyone else in the Republican Party is going to say in the House. And obviously, we already knew what they were going to say in the Senate. We're going to get into all that in just a minute. Lots to talk about. Still ahead, President Trump wanted an investigation into Joe Biden. And now that's exactly what he's getting from Lindsey Graham. Details on the senator's probe of Burisma and Ukraine. But
thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.